I've been wearing the badge in Cold Creek, Iowa, for over 20 years. If you're imagining high-speed chases and drug busts, you're thinking of the wrong kind of town. We have one diner, one gas station, and more cornfields than people. Most of my job involves lost dogs, bored teens, and checking on the old-timers who forget what day it is. But back in October of 2006, I caught a call that still sticks with me. My strangest case, the kind that gets into your bones and never quite leaves. It started around 11:45 p.m. Dispatch radioed in a report of a vehicle parked off Highway 6, just past mile marker 17. A semi-truck driver had called it in, said the car was idling on the shoulder, lights off. Normally I wouldn't think much of it, people pull over to sleep or make phone calls. But the trucker claimed something odd. Said he saw someone standing next to the car, staring at the corn. Not into it, at it. I was the only unit on duty that night. I grabbed a thermos of coffee, flicked on the overheads, and headed out. It was a moonless night, the kind where the stars feel too close, like they're watching. That stretch of Highway 6 is flat and lonely, flanked by endless rows of corn on either side. No lights, no houses, just black fields and the occasional deer darting across the road. When I got to mile marker 17, I saw the car. An older model Ford sedan, light blue, idling with its driver's side door ajar. No hazard lights, no sign of anyone. I parked behind it and got out. The engine was still running, low and rattling, like it had been idling for a while. "Hello?" I called out. "Cold Creek Police. You all right?" No answer. I looked inside the car. A woman's purse sat in the passenger seat. The cup holder had a gas station coffee cup, steam still rising. Driver's license was half tucked into visor. Name was Danielle Everett, age 26. Address listed in Des Moines. These were still in the ignition. What unsettled me, and I didn't notice it until later, was that the driver's seat had been pushed all the way back, farther than someone Danielle's size would need. I drew my flashlight and stepped around the vehicle, scanning the cornfield to the right. The stalks were tall and swaying slightly, but the night was still, too still. "Ma'am?" I tried again, louder. "Danielle?" Then I heard it, a rustling sound. Not wind, something moving just a few rows into the corn. It wasn't fast either, more like pacing. I stepped forward, crunching gravel underfoot, and angled my light into the field. Nothing. Just that wall of stalks, tall and unmoving. I should have called it in then and there. Should have waited for backup. But Cold Creek cops don't exactly get backup. I've responded to bar fights, barn fires, and even a cougar sighting once, all on my own. That's the job. So I stepped into the car. It was like crossing a threshold. The sound of the car behind me faded. My beam of light jittered against the stalks. The dirt underfoot was soft, too soft, like someone had been digging or walking the same path over and over. "Danielle?" I tried again, voice lower now. Something crunched ahead of me. I froze. Then, faintly, I heard a voice. A woman's voice. "Don't let it follow." My flashlight flicked. I banged it against my palm. When it steadied, I swung the beam forward, and that's when I saw her. Danielle, standing maybe 10 feet ahead, barefoot in the dirt. Pale. Her eyes were wide, not crying, not blinking, just staring at me. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out this time. She was shaking. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Hall from Cold Creek PD," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "You're all right. Let's get you back to the car." She blinked, slow, and pointed behind me. I turned. There was nothing there, just corn. When I looked back, Danielle was gone. No sound, no movement, no trace of where she'd gone. He shouted for her, ran forward, nothing but more corn and dirt. I backed out of that field faster than I care to admit. My heart was thudding, and every crackle of the stalk sounded like footsteps behind me. When I got back to the car, I radioed for state assistance and locked the cruiser doors. They didn't arrive for almost 30 minutes. By then, I'd searched with my flashlight again, but found nothing. Not a footprint, not a thread of clothing. They impounded the car. Danielle Everett was listed as missing the next morning. The oddest part? The security footage from a rest stop 15 miles east, time-stamped just 1 hour after my call, shows Danielle standing alone staring into the woods off the highway, then walking in. She was barefoot and smiling. The next morning, I drove out to the impound lot to look at Danielle's car again. Something about the whole thing sat wrong with me. I've dealt with missing persons before. Usually they turn up at their boyfriend's place in Boone or passed out at the truck stop. But this felt different, like I'd been allowed to see something I wasn't supposed to. Her car was locked up tight in Bay 3. I signed the logbook and let myself in. The interior smelled stale now, like engine oil and old paper. The purse was still on the seat, tagged by state officers. I flipped it open. Lipstick, a phone charger, 2 protein bars, and a phone. Dead, of course. Her driver's license and a receipt from a gas station near Des Moines, timestamped the day before. Nothing weird, nothing out of place. Except the coffee. That bothered me. The cup was still in the holder. The lid had warped from the heat overnight, and the coffee was nearly evaporated by then, but what stuck with me was how fresh it had been when I arrived. Steam still rising. Like she'd just gotten out of the car seconds before I showed up. Like she'd known I was coming. I drove to the nearest Iowa State Patrol office and asked to speak with the trooper assigned to the case. Young guy, Freeman, told me he was the one who pulled the rest stop footage and confirmed it was Danielle. Same clothes, same face. What was she doing? I asked. He pulled up the footage again. There she was, 1:19 a.m. Walking past the vending machines at the Newton rest stop, no shoes. Moving like she didn't notice the cold, she paused near the edge of the sidewalk and turned toward the tree line. Then she just stood there for 6 minutes, then walked into the trees without so much as a glance back. Any idea where she went? I asked. Freeman shook his head. Search teams found no trace, not a footprint, not a sock. Dogs wouldn't go in past the first 20 feet, acted like something was in there. You see the way she looked at the woods? I asked him, like they were calling her. He raised an eyebrow. You buy into that kind of thing, Officer Hall? I didn't answer him, just thanked him and left. I spent the next couple days driving the back roads between Cold Creek and Newton, checked in with every gas station clerk, motel owner, and lonely farmer who might have seen something. Most hadn't. One did. A rancher about 3 miles off the highway near Wolf Hollow said his dog started going crazy the night Danielle went missing. Said he stepped outside and saw someone, a woman, standing in the corn behind his property. Thought she was a ghost, he told me, shaking his head, just standing still, watching the house. I hollered at her, but she didn't move. Then she walked off into the dark. What time was that? Couple minutes after midnight. Same time I'd seen her on Highway 6. You sure it was a woman? He looked at me, real serious. I'm sure it looked like one. 2 days later, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, it was just static, then a faint voice, not a woman's. A man's. She's not missing, it said. She's listening. I froze. Who is this? I asked. Silence. Then the line cut. The number was untraceable. I reported it to state, but they brushed it off. Said I was rattled. Maybe I was. But something in that voice sounded off. Like it had been recorded backwards, then played through a wall. A week after Danielle vanished, her parents came to town. I met them in the station lobby. Her mother was in tears. Her father wouldn't look me in the eye. Said Danielle had no history of mental illness, no substance abuse, no reason to run. She called me the night before. her mother said. She was cheerful, said she was driving to visit an old friend in Kansas. But she didn't have any friends there, not that I know of. Did you say anything else? Her mother paused. She asked if I remembered the cornfield behind our first house. The one with the scarecrow. I blinked. What about it? She said it wasn't a scarecrow, she whispered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice. Not from the cornfield, but from the rest stop footage. Silent, still, calm. Like something had emptied her out. Like she wasn't Danielle anymore. Around 2 a.m. I went for a drive. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, but I knew. Mile marker 17. When I got there, the highway was empty. My headlights cut through the dark like knives. I pulled off to the shoulder and killed the engine. The silence was unbearable, pressing, like something was leaning in from the corn. Then I heard it, rustling, crunching dirt, a whisper. Don't let it follow. I turned on my flashlight and stepped out. I didn't go far, just enough to see between the rows. There was no one there, but there were footprints, bare, small, leading into the corn, then stopping, dead stop, like the person had vanished in mid-step. And above them, a long narrow piece of fabric, caught on a stalk, red, like from a hoodie. Danielle's hoodie. I didn't touch it. I just got in the cruiser and drove home. I didn't tell anyone what I found that night. The red fabric, the footprints that stopped like the earth had swallowed her whole. And I sure as hell didn't tell them about what happened the next night, because that's when I saw her again. Not Danielle exactly, not how I remembered her. I was home, sitting on my porch with a beer, trying to pretend the dark out there didn't press on my chest like a weight. The fields behind my property stretch out for miles. No houses, no lights, just corn and wind, and lately, the sound of something moving where nothing should. It started around 11:40. First, the dogs down the road started barking. Not that panicked yappy bark, the deep, alert kind, warning barks. A few seconds later they stopped, all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. Then came the silence. That's how I knew something was out there. I stepped down off the porch, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the edge of the corn. That's when I saw her, just inside the stalks, half visible. A woman, same height, same build. But it wasn't right. Her arms were too long, her head tilted in this jerky, unnatural way, like she wasn't sure how a neck was supposed to work. And her eyes. They caught the beam of my flashlight, but they didn't reflect like animal eyes. They didn't glow. They absorbed the light, like two holes in the world. She took a step forward, and I swear to God I heard my own voice come out of her mouth. Officer Hall, it said, calm and empty. Come listen. That was enough. I backed up and shut the door behind me. I locked it, deadbolt and all, then sat in the dark with my shotgun across my lap until the sun came up. When I finally opened the door again, the only thing out there was a single red thread, blowing gently in the wind. I filed an official report that day, vague as I could make it without lying outright. Unidentified female sighted in cornfield near residence. Suspect fled when approached. Technically true, but I left out the part where the suspect knew my name and mimicked my voice and looked like something that had never been human to begin with. Later that morning, I stopped by Cold Creek's only diner for coffee. Norma, who owns the place, waved me over. You hear about Errol Fisk? She asked. Harold was the retired mail carrier who lived out by Old Mill Road, grumpy, kind of a hermit. Used to deliver mail back in the 1980s. What about him? Found him dead in his backyard yesterday. No sign of a struggle. Coroner says it looked like he froze to death. She nodded slowly. Had a weird look on his face, too. Not scared exactly, just hollow, like he'd seen something too big to understand. I felt my stomach knot. Did he mention anything strange lately? See anything? Norma leaned in close, her voice dropping low. Came in here last week talking about voices in the trees. Said he heard a woman outside at night whispering his name. Said he saw her walking the fence line in the fog. No footprints, just gliding. I thanked her and left. I didn't finish my coffee. I went back to Harold's place that afternoon. It wasn't officially in my jurisdiction, but I told the deputy on duty I wanted to look around. He didn't argue, just handed me the keys and told me, "Watch the corn. The crows won't even go near it lately." I found Harold's house, still mostly untouched. Mug in the sink, mail on the table. TV paused on an old western. The screen static now. But it was what I found outside that made my blood run cold. About 30 yards from the back door, at the edge of the field, I found something hanging from a low branch. Not a scarecrow, not really. It was a bundle of twine and sticks shaped vaguely like a person, wrapped in red fabric, stuffed with old hair and something that smelled like mildew. It reminded me of those old Appalachian witch dolls I'd seen in museums, except this one had teeth. Human teeth. And something had carved two small symbols into the bark behind it. Circles, each with a dot in the center. Eyes. I touched the branch without thinking. It was ice cold, even though the day was nearly 70 degrees. I left, didn't touch anything else, just radioed it in as possible cult activity and drove straight to the station. I didn't sleep that night either, but I did sit at my desk, watching Danielle's rest stop footage again, over and over and over, looking for anything I missed. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the frame, when she stops to stare at the trees, there's a shape, barely visible in the dark, just past the safety rail. Long, thin, not moving. At first I thought it was a tree trunk, but trees don't lean forward when you zoom in. They don't watch you back. 2 days after Harold was found, the field started humming. It wasn't loud exactly, not like an engine or a machine, more like a low, drawn-out vibration just beneath hearing. You didn't notice it right away, but once you did, it stuck in your bones. The farmers noticed first. One by one they started coming in, asking me if there'd been a chemical spill, or maybe seismic activity. One guy said he thought he had tinnitus, until his dog started whining and pawing at the ground like it was going to open up. Another said his wife woke up crying, hands clamped over her ears, claiming she could hear someone talking under the soil. And then there was Larry. Larry McDowell was the town's unofficial corn king. He farmed nearly 200 acres just west of Cold Creek and had been doing it since I was in diapers. Never believed in anything he couldn't see, shoot, or plow under. But he came into my office, pale as drywall. Said he'd been out checking irrigation around dusk when he saw someone walking between the rows, just on the edge of the light. He called out, figured it was one of his farmhands. No answer, so he chased after them. Said they were fast, too fast, and didn't move right. No rustling, no sound, just the motion, like a deer sprinting without a sound. Then the humming started. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head, and said it felt like something was reaching through his thoughts, flipping through memories, like a priest through hymnals. And then he heard her voice, soft, familiar. It said, "Do you remember the river, Larry?" He did. He told me through gritted teeth that when he was a boy, he watched his little brother drown in the Mequoketa during a storm. They'd gone in without telling their folks. Only he and the water knew. He said it wasn't a voice exactly, it was the memory itself, talking to him. And whatever it was, it knew everything. Larry told me I got up and ran, Sheriff. I don't care if you think I'm crazy. I ran like that field was on fire. I didn't think he was crazy. I was starting to think none of us were. That night, I finally gave in and called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. My old partner, Terry Clune. He'd left Cold Creek in the early 2000s, after what we unofficially referred to as the Creek Incident. A woman went missing down by the river and was found a week later, floating but bone dry, like she'd been emptied out then preserved. Terry lost his taste for this town after that, moved west, became a park ranger. Hall, he said, his voice crackling with static. It's been a long time. Terry, I need your help. Weird things are happening here again. There was a pause on the line. Is it the corn? I froze. It continued. I had a dream last night. You were standing in the middle of a cornfield. You were screaming, but your mouth wasn't moving. And behind you, something was coming up out of the ground. Long, thin arms. Too many elbows. My skin crawled. Terry? Why now? I don't know, he said, voice quiet. But I think, whatever this is, it's older than Cold Creek. Older than Iowa. It's not interested in killing. It wants attention. And it's using our memories to bait the hook. The next day, I drove to the Old Town Archives, down in the basement below City Hall. Most people don't go down there anymore. Damp smell, poor lighting, the kind of place where paper doesn't just yellow, it rots. But I had a hunch. If this thing, this presence, had happened before, someone must have written it down. And I was right. I found a file labeled simply Unexplained Phenomena, 1892 Harvest. Inside were brittle reports written in that heavy-inked cursive, detailing missing livestock, barren circles in cornfields, unseasonal frost. But what chilled me was the last page. A short letter, unsigned, dated October 30th. The fields are not ours. They are only rented, and the rent comes due when the wind forgets its name. I saw her again last night. Not my wife. Not anymore. She said I remembered too much. I think the corn wants us to forget. That night, I returned to the site where Danielle had vanished. I stood at the edge of the road, the night thick around me, flashlight in hand. I stared at the field, and that's when the humming started again. Low, subterranean, like something enormous shifting beneath the roots. The flashlight flickered. The beam landed on something just inside the first row of corn. It was her, Danielle, except her eyes were gone, not gouged out, just absent, like someone had erased that part of her. Tougher the causes. She raised a hand slowly and opened her mouth, but instead of speaking, she played a sound. It was the audio from her last call to 911. Only, it wasn't her voice anymore. It was mine, calling for help. And then her jaw unhinged wider than it should, and the hum rose to a howl. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my cruiser. When I looked back, there was no one in the field, just rows of still, whispering corn. I barely slept after seeing Danielle in the field. If it was Danielle. I kept trying to convince myself it was a hallucination, maybe the stress finally catching up with me. I even went so far as to schedule an appointment with the clinic's only therapist. He listened politely, then asked me to describe the humming. When I did, he went quiet, just nodded, slowly. Then said, "Sheriff, last week I heard voices coming through my office vents. I thought it was psychosis at first. Then one of the voices told me about my brother's accident, the one nobody in town even knew about." I didn't go back. That afternoon, I got the call. A group of teenagers had wandered into the fields on a dare. 3 had made it out, screaming about the woman without eyes. 1 hadn't come back. His name was Micah Hensley, 17, star wide receiver. And now, missing somewhere in the miles of tall, whispering corn. I gathered a search party. Half the town showed up, wielding lanterns, megaphones, dogs. We combed the fields until dark. Dogs barked and whimpered, leading us in spirals. Radios crackled with static. And then, somewhere deep inside the rows, I heard humming. Not beneath me. Around me. Like it was coming from the corn itself. I shouted for Micah. Something answered. It wasn't a voice. It was a memory. Mine. projected back at me like an echo in someone else's mouth. The day my father died, the silence after the heart monitor flatlined, the way I didn't cry. I staggered backward, cold sweat crawling down my spine. The cord around me breathed in and out. I swear to God it moved. And in that moment, I realized something. It wasn't just feeding off us, it was cataloging us, collecting pain, regret, memories, like souvenirs. We found Micah's shirt an hour later, torn, wet, but not with blood, with mud. Thick, black, reeking of mildew and rot. It smelt like a cellar that had been buried. Then the kid came crawling out of the corn on his own, clothes shredded, eyes wide, skin pale. He kept whispering the same thing over and over. It reminds me now. It said it won't forget me. I told it about the lake. I told it everything. I didn't mean to. We rushed him to the clinic, but nothing they did helped. He wouldn't stop shaking. And the whole time, he kept glancing toward the cornfields through the window, as if it was still listening. I called Terry again that night. He didn't answer. Instead, I got a voicemail. But not one I'd ever recorded. It was me. But older. Slower. If you're hearing this, I guess you're still trying to fight it. Just know this, Hall. It doesn't kill. Not really. It just archives. You can't burn it. Can't outrun it. The only mercy left is forgetting. If you remember too much, you become part of the crop. Click. I didn't sleep that night either. That was 2 months ago. Since then, the fields have gone quiet. The humming stopped. The corn grew 10 feet that season, a record harvest. Every stalk is perfectly shaped. But nobody's eating it. The townsfolk refuse to touch it. Most of the farmers won't even sell it. Some of them plowed it under. One burned his whole field and moved out of state. Micah transferred schools. He doesn't talk to anyone. Danielle's body was never recovered. Her case sits unsolved in the drawer next to a dozen others I now wonder about. As for me, I still drive by the fields some nights, and sometimes, if I roll the window down, I swear I hear voices rising with the wind, not crying, not screaming. Just remembering every regret, every lost moment, every sin, spoken softly by the corn. And I think about that letter from 1892, the one that said, "The fields are not ours, they are only rented, and the rent comes due when the wind forgets its name." I think that time is coming again, because 2 nights ago, I found a fresh set of footprints leading into the stalks, and a voice on the wind that whispered, "Sheriff Hall, do you remember me?"